Hey team, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to look at C# timers. I have 3 of them to show you. Let's do it. This video is about how to use timers. .NET has 6 types of timers. In this video, I will use 3 of them. Below in the comments, I have provided all the source code for this video. Let me demo this app so you can see the features we have to write. So it starts off with, I get to pick my timer I want to use, and new in .NET 6 is periodic. Let's begin with that. I can start a timer and then I can just reset. I can start a timer and then I can pause that timer and then, come back 20 minutes later and just resume it and then stop it. Let's go to the next one. Dispatcher. I'm gonna start it. I get to pause it. I get to resume it. I get to reset it. And the last one is Timers.Timer. Start it, then we get to pause, stop, and reset. Let us create a new project. Go File, New, Project. Our type will be C# Windows Desktop. Look for WPF application, press Next. The name of our app will be called 3 Timers. Next. We want to choose .NET 6.0, Create, and there you have it. Add new class, and then what we want to do is we want to add the class name called AppTimerType. Click on the add button, and then what I'd like to do is replace all that code with something real simple, and it is just an ENUM. And notice that we say AppTimerType. It's of type integer, and these are my 3 timer types. Then all we have to do is press the save button. Now let's add 3 classes and 1 user control. These are the name of our classes and this is the name of our control. Now right click on 3 timers and then add a new item. Let's add a class. This class will be called .NET 6 periodic timer. Let's do that. Click on the add button. Our second class, right click on 3 timers, then add a class, and then it's called my Dispatcher.Timer. Add, that's all done. Our next class, right click on 3 timers, then add a class, and then this one is going to be called Timers.Timer. Then click on the add button. Let me walk you all the way through on this user control. So right click, say add, then look for where it says user control, WPF. And when this comes up, we're actually going to name it Timer Control. So come down here and type in timer, CTRL, and then click on the add button and give that a second. And then guess what, team? We've done it. We have created our 4 files. Now we're going to build the control XAML. So open up the file timer control. It's this guy. So click on that and that opens up our XAML. Now notice that we can use this up and down arrow keys and this will switch between what we can see and the XAML. So we're going to be down here in the code view. Let's first change the height to 334 and the width to 200. Let's give this grid a name and a background color. Notice the grid name is timer grid and the background is light gray. Our grid will have both row definitions and column definitions. Let's get in lines 11 and 12. Now, as you can see, I have buttons going down the middle of here, and notice that I've got a little gutter in between each of these buttons. And then I have a area for a timer, and I got another area for a timer label. Then I have a drop-down combo over here. So what we're going to do is we're going to define our rows. So all we have to do is drag and drop our controls. Now how we will define our layout in rows, notice that we have a button, and underneath that button there's like a little gutter, then button, gutter, you see that. Well, guess what? Up here there are gutters, we just can't see them. And the format kind of looks like this. It's a height of 40 and then a gutter of 2. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, we have 8 of those. So let's copy this down a total of 7 times. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then at the very bottom, we don't need a gutter at the bottom of our form. We just need that. So from lines 12 to 26, that is our row definitions. As you can see from this app, we only have one column. So what we'll do is we'll just make that 200 wide. So that's a column definition with 200. Now make sure from 10 to 32 your code looks just like this. Now what I did is I clicked on this little collapse because we don't need to see that anymore, but you know it's there. Now when we add controls to a grid, we have to be inside of the grid body. As you can see here, I've got a label, I've got another label, and then I have buttons and then a drop-down combo. So all of those will live inside of here. So I just dropped in a label. Its name is title bar. Notice its content is timer. You can see that right here. Now the background is black and the foreground is white. So black on the back, white on the front. Then we're going to vertical alignment stretch. Notice I'm in grid row 0. All of ours will be column 0, so this is optional. And then our horizontal content alignment is the center. Go ahead and get in our first label. We're now looking at our clock. Notice I called it TB, text block, clock. I initialized it with this format. I used a font size 28. And why did I use this font Gonzalez? Well, you see how there are slashes in the 0? Well, that makes time easy to read. Notice now we're in row 2. We were in row 0 in the first one. Remember, we have a gutter column between each of our big fields. Now we're working on our buttons. It's of type of button. Notice we have start timer. And when the user clicks on that, we're actually going to call a method called button start click. Notice I'm on row 4. Now we're on pause display and we're on row 6. When the user clicks on pause, we're going to call button pause click. Resume display, row 8. Button resume click, resume display. Stop timer, that's button stop click. Notice that we're on now row 10. We only have 2 more controls, the reset and this drop down combo. So let's get the reset button in there. That will be at grid row 12. Button reset click. And at the very bottom we have our combo box. Notice I called it timer name. It's on grid row 14. And then inside of this control we have 3 other controls. They're all of the same type, combo box item. Notice I give it a content where we got our periodic, our dispatcher, and our timers. Then I use is selected. Notice one of them is true, the other are false. And that is all the source code that we have for our user control, 70 lines of code. Now we have finished the code for TimerCtrl.xaml. We're going to work on the TimerCtrl.xaml C#. That's the code behind. Let's begin by cleaning up these using statements. Notice we're just going to be using these 5. We can remove this comment as well. Now once we get in here, we're going to use that ENUM that we did at the very beginning. Remember typing in AppTimer? And I'm going to default that to periodic timer. And then remember I had us create 3 class files? Well, we're going to be using them as well. So we are going to have a .NET 6 periodic timer. The question mark means it's nullable. And it's nullable because look, right away I assign null to it. So we have our periodic timer, we got our dispatch timer, and our timers timer. So notice our app, notice where it says start timer. This is kind of where this app begins. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, I want to use any one of these timers when I click on the start button. So before you see the source code, how would you solve that? Now, do you remember when we set up this AppTimerType and I defaulted it to periodic timer? Now, when I hit the start button, notice I can come over here and I can change it to any of them. So when I hit this start button, I want to use the dispatch timer. So what I would like to do is I would like to be able to reset this object to the value of this combo box. So this is called a timer name, that combo box, and I'm going to get this selected index. Notice when it's 0, I'm going to say periodic timer, 1 dispatcher timer, and 2 timer. So you can see that 0, 1, and 2. Now AppTimerType, is set correctly. So when we hit the start button, I know which one to use. Now watch this nugget here. We're going to actually say switch, and I'm going to switch on this AppTimerType. And I'm not going to go type in all these case statements. Notice I've got this little lightning bolt thing over here, quick actions. And then I'm going to come down and I'm going to say missing cases. So notice that just plug those in there for me. Let us begin with periodic timer. So notice we're putting open and close curlies. This is the name of my class object. And then what is this? Well, this is actually this whole object. So .NET Timer, I'm going to get all these buttons, so I'll be doing all the state management in other classes. Now you'll notice I got these red underscores here, and I'm using an await. Now notice up here in our method, I don't have a async. So if you're going to use this, you got to use this. Now on this .NET Timer, well, we don't have a constructor done on this yet. And I don't have this method in there, so we're going to have to come back to this in just a minute. But for periodic timer, when someone clicks this button, I'm going to call this class, and then I'm going to start it up. It's got a method in there called startAsync. Now for dispatcher and timer, I pretty much followed the same practice. You can see here I put in our dispatcher timer and then our timers timer. Notice I'm sending in this into all three, and then on this last one, timers timer, this one's a little bit more complicated. I have to send in the dispatcher current dispatcher. So this is all about threads, and we have a UI thread, and we have to keep in sync with it because we're actually writing back to the screen. So in our background processes, we have to get into a queue. And that queue has access to the threads. And when it's safe to get in there, then it'll get in there and update this value. Now I need to warn you one thing about all these timers. Sometimes this counter doesn't seem like it's really in sync, because if your machine is real busy, you're running a bunch of other processes, it is quite possible that the thread doesn't come around every 1 second. You might be doing something real busy. Now, if your machine isn't doing anything, this right here should not give you any issues. But hopefully you've been able to take from 35 to 55, and that is all the source code for the start timer button. Let us work on the next button, pause display. Now you're going to notice the code is almost identical because this is the format of this whole app. I have to switch between the AppTimerType. And notice when I say switch AppTimerType, I can do one of our three, right? So on all of these buttons, it's always this same case. On pause display, remember that button was button pause click. Notice switch AppTimerType. I told you it would be that. So in each of these class objects, I'm going to have a method in there called pause. That's how easy it is. And that is pause display. Now we're on the resume display. Notice that button was button resume click. I'm still switching off AppTimerType. Then you're starting to know what this means now. So in this class object that we defined at the very top, I also have a resume function. Now, what does that question mark mean? Well, that means this data type originally was nullable. If this is null, I won't do this line. But if it's not null, I will actually try to perform the resume feature of the timer. And there you have the button resume. Now we're on to stop timer. Now, without me even telling you what I need to do, can you imagine it's just going to say the same code and just say the word stop? You guessed it. So let's hide that and let's paste in this code. So now we are switching on that AppTimerType, and now we're calling the stop method. That means each of these class objects have a method called stop. And our last button, reset, well, it's just like this code. Instead of the word stop, we're going to have the word reset. And there you have button reset. Notice we have our class objects and we have our methods reset. As you can see here, I kind of like have a pattern that I'm following, and I just try to keep it as simple as possible. Let us begin with the .NET 6 periodic timer. Notice that we're going to be using these 7 using statements. We'll say public here, and then let's drop in some local variables. We have our periodic timer, it's nullable, ptimer. Then we have our started at date time. Then we have an elapsed time and a pause time. And then we have our control. Then what we can say is CTOR and then hit tab, and that will give us our constructor. And remember, when we were going to call this object, we had to send in this. So what we have to do is we have to say time control, and I'm going to call that CTRL. And then what we're going to do is see how I made a local variable here. So I'm going to say this.myTimer equals control. Cool. Now we're going to get onto those methods that we created in each of our, remember how we said start, then we said pause, resume, stop, reset. Now we have to write those in here. Let us first begin with a method that allows us to change the enable state on each of the buttons. So if you can remember when I used the app, as I started it, remember buttons turned on and off. Remember that? Perfect. So this set button is enabled will be for each of our buttons. Now my timer control, remember I sent that through the constructor. So now I have access to the actual control, and these are the control button names. So when I click on the stop timer, if ptimer is not null, I'm going to say ptimer dispose. This is how you stop a periodic timer. You say dispose, and then I'm going to set that object to null. Then I'm going to reset the elapsed time and the pause time using the time span, and these are just different ways that you can do it, and these are going all the way to the second. Then I'm going to call that set button is enable state, and then notice I'm sending it by name. So even though it starts with here start, pause, resume, reset, and stop, I can send these in any order if I do it in this way. And there you have the stop button. Notice on resume, I'm calling that one method, and notice that I put all the ones that I want false on top and all the ones I want true on the bottom. That just proves to you order doesn't matter if I send in a named argument. So we have finished, stop, resume. Now we're on pause. Notice on pause, I just have to call that same method to set the button states. And I saved the last 2 methods that are long for last. The first one is reset. Notice I'm going to say, is that ptimer not null? If it isn't null, I'm going to say dispose. Well, we just learned in the stop method that when you set it to false, to dispose, it actually stops the timer. Then I'm going to set the object to null. I'm going to reset the elapsed time and the pause time. I'm going to go update my button state, and then I'm going to change back the clock to this format right here, 00:00:00. That's what that line does on 40. And there is the reset method. Now we're going to start with start async. Notice I'm on an async method. Do you remember when we were working on the timer control and I said p.NET 6 timer, and then I send in this? Well, that went to the constructor. But then I had to say await start async. Well, that's where we're at right now. This is a async method. You may be wondering, why are there 6 timers? Well, through evolution, each timer has changed. Now the .NET 6 version, the periodic timer, the main purpose behind this timer is to avoid calling callbacks. And we'll see when we get to these other timers how callbacks are used. Now notice here, my periodic timer, my time span is 1 second, and then I said my started date time is now, and then I just set the elapsed and pause to zeros. And now you can see the reason why we had to use async is because on line 32, I have to await this asynchronous method, wait for next tick. Now notice each tick will be at the 1 second mark. So I'm going to stay inside of this loop, and when the button pause is enabled as true, I'm just going to keep, making time, right? Everything is running fine. But now when the button pause is enabled, someone clicked it, then I'm going to start racking up the pause time. Then notice as soon as it comes back on and that pause time is total milliseconds is greater than 0, I'm going to subtract that from the elapsed time. And then I'm going to start cranking on the minutes again and the seconds. You know what I'm saying? So I just stay inside of this loop until the user, changes this. They hit dispose, and dispose stops the timer. And that is the source code for the .NET 6 periodic timer. Now we're looking at the dispatch timer. We're going to start with our using statements. We just have 2 of them. Nice. Let's turn this into public, and then we can do a CTOR, hit tab twice. And then remember, we want to pass in this whole object, this timer control. So let's declare a few variables here that we're going to be needing. And pretty much it's the same as our periodic one. We're just only changing the dispatch timer. Here we're calling it dtimer. Now here I want to send in my timer control. We're going to call that CTRL, and then say this.myTimerControl equals CTRL. All right, so now we have our constructor set up. So now I have access to my timer control, all of those buttons, so I can do state management with inside of my dispatcher. Now, using a timer in a WPF, this is the easiest one to use. You don't have to worry about threads because the dispatcher is the thread. So it manages all that for us. So let's begin with the start method of this control. So notice here, pause time, initializing it to a bunch of zeros. And then notice that we say send, and then my interval is 1 second. And then every time that 1 second executes, I'm going to perform this method called dtimerTick, and it's actually going to call a method called dtimer_tick. We got to write that in just a moment. To actually create that, all you have to do is say plus equals, then tab, and then notice the stub gets generated for you. Then remember in our last method, .NET 6 periodic timer, I had that method called set button is enabled state. Well, I have it in this one as well. Let's go harvest that. So I'm going to get down to the bottom, and this is the method. And notice that error went away. And now we need to write this timer tick. Now, what happens is every 1 second, this method will get called. And what do we want to do when that happens? Well, you can imagine it. I want to increment the value that's here. And I also have to check to see if a user has clicked one of these buttons. So that's what we're going to do inside of this method. You guessed it, dtimerTick. The internal is the same as our periodic timer. Remember when we did this? Now the only thing that was different was this while await, wait for next tick. Remember the main purpose of this timer was to avoid a callback? Well, here's the callback. And now we have to program, because remember this is going to come out and execute this. And now every 1 second this will be executed. So that was easy to do. That was the exact same code from the periodic timer. Now we're going to be looking at the reset button. Now the reset is actually going to use stop. Then I'm going to set that object to null. I'm going to reset those elapsed timer and pause timers. I'm going to set the button state, and then I'm going to reset that clock. So everything gets back to this view that you see here. The pause and the resume are the exact same code as when we did the periodic timer. Notice identical. So they're just changing the state of our form. As comparing the stop with the periodic time, remember we used dispose here. And here on the dispatcher, we're saying stop. The rest of the code is the same. And guess what? That's the code for the dispatcher timer. Remember, this is the easiest one to use inside of a WPF where we're doing screen I/O. Here we go with our last class object, Timers.Timer. Let us begin with replacing our using statements. We just have 3 of them. Then let's make this public. Now, between our 2 other timer classes, there is a lot of code that is replicated. And the reason why I didn't pull that out is because I sometimes just like to come in and grab a class, stick it into another project, and guess what? I have everything. I don't have to go start unwinding an application. So I just put it all in one. So let us begin with our objects that we're going to be using in this class. Notice it all starts off with system timers timer, made that nullable _timer. And then this is I don't know if I said it yet, but this is the most complicated of the three timers that we have here. Notice that I have a timer control and then I have a dispatcher. Now, where did that come from? Well, do you remember earlier on when we did the dispatch timer, I told you this is kind of like the easiest one, and there is no threading in here. This timer by itself manages all the threads. Now, Timers.Timer, we got to manage all that. So that's why I call it the more complicated one. It's not complicated, it's just more coding, I would say. So let's do this. Now I'm going to say CTOR tap tap, and now we actually have two parameters in this. The first one is that timer control, and we're going to call this CTRL, and then we have that dispatcher, and I'm going to call that little dispatcher. Now we can come down here and say this.myControl is that, and then this.myCurrentThread equals that. IntelliSense is so nice. Now, what is this all about where I'm getting this current thread from who's calling me? Back in timer control on Timers.Timer, notice I'm sending in this, which is the control. You know that now. But notice I'm looking at Dispatcher.currentDispatcher. So this is the current thread that we're using inside of this object. I'm now sending it to this object as a parameter. Now when it comes into the constructor, notice I'm going to take that dispatcher and I'm going to call that my current thread. And with this Timers.Timer, I'm going to start at the bottom again because nothing is different. So we got this method that does our state management for us. And then we have stop. Now stop, there is one difference. And you should see that right away. Notice here I say stop dispose. When we looked at the dispatcher on stop, notice that we just said stop. And when we were on the periodic, we just said dispose. So those are the difference. Then when we get done with that, resume and pause, guess what? The exact same code. There's actually no difference. So you understand what those mean now. On the reset button, notice it's almost just like stop, but I stop it, I dispose it, I set it to null. But then when I reset, what I do is I reset that clock display. I set this back to a bunch of zeros on reset. Now let's look at the meat of this object, the start. Notice we said timer equals new system Timers.Timer. You know what this is? This is the event. You can say plus equals tab tab and it'll generate the stuff for you. Then notice here I set the interval for 1000, that's 1 second. My started at time, my pause time, and then timer auto reset is true and then enable is true. There's another method here called timer start. Now this method, when you say enabled, all this start does is set this to true. That's why I don't put this in here, because I'm doing what this method does is to set that value to true. And then we're calling that state management thing. Now we have the elapsed timer. What do we do inside of there? Well, as I said, this is the most complicated of the three. And it all begins with this current thread. Do you remember when we passed in our constructor and we said this dispatcher, and then I'm going to assign that to my current thread? Notice I'm using that my current thread. Notice here I'm using my current thread begin invoked with a new action. Now the inside of this code is the exact same code in these other two. So let me try to explain what this one line does here on 44. My current thread is that same thread that's being used on the UI. And what it's doing is there is a priority queue, and this is going to wait until I can actually execute this. So it's going to inject this request into a queue. The queue is going to be working its way down, and then when it's this person's turn, it gets to do this. And when it's done, it removes it from there. Unfortunately, this happens every 1 second. So sometimes you may see this lag behind, but this generates, this guarantees that it will always generate, but it doesn't always generate before the 1 second. So sometimes it's after the 1 second mark, and you might see yours pause a little bit because of that threading. Now remember, what can make your computer busy? Well, if you're running some complicated program on your computer in the background, that's taking up CPU cycles. Your threading has to share among all the apps. So once again, I'm using a thread. I begin invoke, it puts it into the queue, and then when it's my turn, I get to do this Same state management as we did in the other one. So I have a little comment in here that may make sense to you. Let me inject that. And that's of course in the source code. And there's the queue I was talking about. And it's this begin evoke is asynchronously. So I think you get it now. Guess what, team? That's all the source code for Timers.Timer. And that's all the code for 3 timers. Let's compile this and let's see if it works. Let's now try to build this app and see if it will compile. I'm going to come to build, rebuild solution, and notice it succeeded. So all the code so far is working. We just need to do one other. As you can see, it builded successfully. Now we need to take this timer control, and we need to add that control to our main window. Let's do that. Before we update main window, let's finish our to-do list. So did we do our periodic timer? Yes, that is done. Did we do our dispatch timer? Yes, that's done. Did we do our timers timer? Yes, that's done. You've heard me say that timers timer is the most complicated. You saw how I had to send around threads to get that to work. Dispatch timer, it takes care of it for us. And this .NET 6 version, it says, hey, I don't need you to do a callback anymore. So that's something new in .NET 6. Now this is done. Now the only thing we have to do is we have to take our control that we wrote. Remember we called it timers control. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add that to a main window XAML. Let me show you step by step how I do that. So the first thing we have to do is open up mywindow.xaml, and let me close some of these windows. And then notice over here that it will say view toolbox, and notice we'll have 3 timers control. See our timer control? Well, that's our timer that we just wrote. So we're going to take that, we're going to drag and drop that onto our control, into our form here. And then notice here it said local timer control, my horizontal alignment is center, and my vertical is center. And guess what, team? That's all we needed to do on that. Let's now run this program and see if this works correctly. Let's save everything, save all. Let's hit the go button, and we'll say debug, start without debugging. And here's our program. Now, we're going to start with the periodic, and I'll hit start timer, and notice it's counting. Then I can say pause display. I can say resume display, and then I can hit reset. We'll set us back to 0. It's cool. Let's go to the second timer. Let's go to dispatcher. And then I'm going to say start timer. How about if I just say stop timer? Cool. Reset it. Nice. How about the third one? On the third one, let's do everything because this is the most complicated. So I started my timer, and now I'm going to pause it. I'm going to resume, and then I'm going to stop it, and then I'm going to reset it. Guess what? You have all the source code for this app. This is yours now. If you do something incredible with this app, send me a message. Let me see what you did. I'd appreciate it. We just finished 3 timers in C#. I hope you were able to learn a thing or two, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them below. A thumbs up if you'd like to. And that's all I have, team. I hope you come back and watch my next video. Until then, take care.